a part of the theory which, as I had said, we will discuss, because that's also something which we need to cover along with the hands-on part of it. So today what I intend to do is, in the first hour, that is till we go for a break, I'll cover some of the theory which is remaining in big data. And once we come back from the break, then we will go back to the remaining examples. Okay. So
So,
I've already, yeah.
so the codes that we wrote for mapper and reducer, how do we run it on Hadoop? Like, cause there were things, right, about the columns and sorting the data. So,
Yeah. So if, let's say, we wish to do the sorting through the command line, then we cannot run that through Hadoop as is. So we will have to do the sorting function inside our Python code itself. So for example, if you are using a list, let's
so
say, we will.
then we'll just be using Hadoop to store that data, right? Cause rest of the processing to we'll be doing through the Python code.
Mm, as we will discuss the theory today, maybe
Yeah,
that point will get clarified. Okay,
yeah,
so
because
Hadoop,
yeah. So because in the questions it's given, right, balance higher than the blue collar averages and all. So my query was about that only, like how we'll do it in a Hadoop framework.
yeah. So even, let's say, when we write the Python code, okay, Hadoop will not just do the storage part. Hadoop will do much more, which we will understand once we once we go through some of the theoretical part. Okay,
Sure.
so in other words, at this moment, what I'll say is, although, let's say, we write the code in Python, for example, rather than having the command prompt do the sorting for us, even then, Hadoop is going to do something on that sort also. So regardless of whether you write that code in Python or Java, or you maybe write your own sorting program, okay, whichever ways, in whatever language you use, uh, Hadoop is going to play an extra role. And what is that role, we will see. Okay, Akash.
Yeah, I'll let's we'll go to the lecture and I'll see if I have any doubts more.
Sure. Okay, so I've already started the recording. I'm now sharing the screen. So first I'll discuss um a point which is very popular from the point of view of job interview questions, or in general, when people know that you have learned something called as big data, okay, at least to a certain extent, if not all the possible technologies, they are asked to this question, which is what are the 4 or 5, because in some cases only 4 of these are considered, and in some cases even value is considered. So what are the 4 or 5 V's of big data? And because they all begin with the letter V, they are called as the V's. In other terminology, people simply call these as the characteristics of big data. So these characteristics are volume, velocity, variety, veracity, and, as I said, the additional fifth one, sometimes that we also speak of, is the value. And as I said, it's a very popular job interview question, or in general, this is something that we should be knowing in case we have learned big data. So what are these 5 V's So when we speak about the volume, that's really the data which is at rest, in the sense that the data has been gathered, the data has been maybe cleaned, and the data is stored somewhere. So the data is not moving. So when the data is not moving from one place to another, even handling that much of data is a challenge, and that's the volume challenge of big data. Second is when the data at rest starts moving, then velocity of that data also becomes a challenge. To take a simple example, if let's say we are talking about a streaming platform, okay, let's say for example we are considering say Netflix obviously will have a huge collection of films and shows and all that. So that will be the volume challenge. How does Netflix, for example, store it? And once a lot of users start streaming it, then the velocity becomes the challenge more than the volume, because data has been stored, data is accessible. But now, how do you move it from wherever it is stored to wherever it is being consumed at the right speed? That is the second challenge. Third is the variety, which is we don't just talk about text anymore. So we have text, we have images, we have graphics, we have audio, we have video. So a number of data formats, including the text as the basic format and subsequently all types of multimedia data. How do we handle this huge different types of data, and many more in the future are likely to also come in? That is a challenge of what we call as the variety of data. And then comes the issue of veracity, where whatever data we are using, do we trust all that data? Do we uh, really have conviction that all that data is correct, or do we have some doubt about it? So how do we deal with it? That's the challenge of veracity. And finally, when data is in motion, uh, or even when data is stored, sometimes data is in what we call as limbo, which means that we're not really sure whether this is the data that we should be using, or we should wait for an update, uh, whether this much of data is sufficient. Okay, parts of the data may be available and other parts may not be available. So what do we do? So that is sometimes, as I said, considered as the last challenge of the big data technologies. Not all software projects will have all the challenges. Not all applications will give equal importance to all the V's. Sometimes volume itself could be a huge challenge and others may not be such challenges. Sometimes because you expect fast throughput or high throughput, the velocity of data could be a challenge, but others may not be. So we should not consider that all the V's are always challenges for uh, application programmers, designers, testers in all the projects. In some cases, we may only have one or two of these as challenges, and others may really be non-issues. Okay. So we'll just quickly cover these types of challenges. So when we speak about volume, big data is a form of data whose volume is so large that it would not fit on a single machine, and therefore specialized tools and frameworks are required to store, process, and analyze such data. Okay. As we are aware that the size of data or volume of data is so large, Okay, for example, social media applications process billions of messages every day. Industrial and energy systems can generate terabytes of sensor data every day. For example, I think we had mentioned this in one slide. It is said that one uh, flight, okay, of passengers generates close to about half terabyte of data. Okay, and if we consider how many people fly every single day in pre-COVID or let's say post-COVID situations, if we look at that number, that itself is something which is mind-boggling. That much of data will get generated simply by way of flights, let alone everything else that happens in the world. And today, because of IoT, everywhere, more and more sensors are coming in. Alerts need to be generated. Those again need to be maybe captured somewhere. So much of data is getting generated, and that uh, will increase going forward. And then we have so many other things like cab aggregation services, the various forms of transactions that happen, and so on and so forth. So the volume of data generated by modern IT, industrial, healthcare, IoT, and other systems is growing exponentially. At the same time, the costs of data storage and data processing have been reducing, as we know. For example, obtaining, let's say, even a few MB worth of data storage on a pen drive used to be considered as a luxury a few years ago, but today pen drives are easily available with capacities in GB and probably very soon in TB. Hard disks are very commonly now in terabytes capacity. So the cost of storing data has been reducing, and which is why more and more data can easily be created also, because people know that they can store this data quite easily. But the point is, although these costs are reducing and the processing architectures are available, a very important point is how do we extract valuable insights from the data. So it's not just about storing some data, okay, almost as if you're dumping something in garbage, but from that huge piles of data, how do we uh, derive certain observations, insights, so that we use that data to improve something. It could be a business process, it could be to do things more efficiently, it could be to serve the customers better, and so on and so forth. Hundreds of such examples can be considered. Now, there is no fixed threshold for the volume of data to be called as big data. So there's no standard definition as such, but normally the term big data is used for what we consider as really massive scales of data, and that data is difficult to store, manage, and process using the traditional RDBMS and other data processing architectures. So it becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible. Having discussed the storage part, second issue that comes up is the velocity. So velocity of data refers to how fast is the data generated and also consumed. For example, data generated by certain sources can arrive at very high velocities. For example, social media data or sensor data. I'm sure all of us maybe explicitly don't think about it, but know this, that the way we use, for example, Insta, we use WhatsApp, we use all other social media platforms. Every second, literally, there is something or the other which comes into our feed. We ourselves keep contributing to that feed. So we know that the velocity of data, that is the speed at which so much of data is getting generated, is very high. Again, the second point that is mentioned here, which is the sensor data, which is going to create unprecedented amounts of data in the case of IoT. So velocity is another important characteristic of big data and the primary reason for the exponential growth of data. So if we don't have such speed, then probably so much of data may not get generated. But because now almost every single individual in the world is generating so much of data, when I say single individual, whosoever is accessing the internet, okay, so there is obviously a still a large section of the population, unfortunately, which does not have this access. But I'm restricting this discussion to the fortunate ones who can. And high velocity of data results in the volume of data accumulated to become very large in short span of time, right? So some applications can have strict deadlines for data analysis, such as trading or online fraud detection, and that data needs to be analyzed in real time. So one is the speed of data. Second is having generated so much of data at so much of speed, what do you do in terms of analyzing that data? So there could be some situations where, let's say, lots and lots of credit card and debit card transactions are happening both in shops as well as on the internet, and a banking system may be receiving literally thousands of such transactions every second. And then in each case, that banking system has to take the transaction and very quickly decide whether that credit card transaction looks all right or whether it seems to be a fraudulent transaction, something is wrong, and if so, it has to decisively act by stopping the transaction immediately. So there is no luxury saying that the transaction will arrive now. So somebody has swiped the credit card somewhere, and let's say we are running that banking system in which that transaction has arrived. Now we cannot say that, okay, let me think about whether the transaction is valid or no. So it may take about 5-10 minutes, and then I'll come back to you. The customer is obviously not going to wait. The shopkeeper is not going to wait. There may actually be a large queue behind that customer. So naturally, this has to happen in a split second time frame. And as you would realize, both the volume of data is already large, and with this additional factor of velocity, it becomes even more urgent for us to be able to receive that data fast and give it back also fast. Live streaming, as I said, is another example where the users would be very upset if the streaming is slow. So naturally, specialized tools are required to ingest such high velocity data into the big data infrastructure and then analyze the data in real time. So some of the code that we are writing, some of the examples that we are trying out actually are examples which people would use in real life. So for example, if let's say there is a new person who needs to be employed, and that person needs to be given a particular let's say role or a particular type of job, and then we wish to very quickly find out what is the average let's say salary for such a person, and based on a lot of other factors, age, maybe the qualification, then similar people who have been enrolled before. So a lot of different factors need to be analyzed in real time. Then somebody would have obviously written a program for this, which we need to now run or execute. And that program has to go to various servers where this data has been stored and quickly come back with an answer in a second, so that we make a decision then and there in real time. So this is not just about being able to store data and receive data fast. It's also about using that data to analyze quickly and respond in real time about what action do we wish to take. Any questions up to this point? Okay, let's move on. The third factor is the variety of data. All right. So variety refers to the forms of the data. And this is actually one of the very, very significant reasons why RDBMS is no longer considered to be the platform or technology of choice when it comes to these modern type of applications. Okay, so at this stage, let me make it very clear. Some of us tend to make this mistake of thinking that RDBMS is dead. So we should not any longer learn SQL. There's no need to worry about normalization. There's no need to worry about, say, MySQL or IBM's DB2 or Oracle. All these are dead. Okay. Never ever think on those lines. That is a completely wrong way of approaching the discussion. So RDBMS is pretty much there. RDBMS is not only alive, but RDBMS is very, very successful even today. And chances are that RDBMS concept and the related technologies will rule the world for many more years to come. But until very recent times, regardless of whatever was the application, regardless of whatever was the business requirement, the solution always used to be RDBMS and nothing else. That has changed. So today, when you ask, let's say, any software architect with a reasonable experience and understanding of various technologies, as to what technology should I use in this particular situation, maybe 2-3 years ago, even 5 years ago, that software architect would have given you a blind sort of answer without even looking at what you are asking. Go ahead and use RDBMS. But today, the same software architect will pause. He or she will think, look at what is the application. So is the application something which we call as a transaction oriented application, an application where let's say you are anyway going to store data which is quite suited for RDBMS type of construct, that is rows, columns, relations among several tables, scheme, the concepts of primary keys and foreign keys, and all the other related aspects of RDBMS. If your application suits those needs, by all means, we must still go ahead and use RDBMS, because there have been lots of things which have been tried and tested in RDBMS, and it has obviously lots of pros, lots of advantages, uh, which we must continue to enjoy. So we cannot flatly say don't use RDBMS. However, there are situations where, for example, the data is not suitable to be stored in the flat structure of an RDBMS in the form of rows and columns. Maybe there is no requirement of storing these in the form of some data in one table, and because we have normalized other data in other tables and joining them using foreign keys. In contrast, it may actually be better to put the whole of the data in one single file or one single place, and then whenever we need that data, just bring it up, all the data, without worrying about keys and all that. There could be other situations, and this slide is important in that context, where we may have data which is not necessarily only text based. So if the data is text based, RDBMS continues to be the preferred mechanism. But the moment the data is not just text, but it is of several other varieties, such as image, audio, video, sensor, okay, as mentioned in the slide, then RDBMS may not be the best choice, because RDBMS does allow us to store images also. It's not as if it's not possible, but RDBMS is not meant for doing this. RDBMS was not created to store such types of data. Okay, just as we are on the subject, by the way, very quickly, how do we store, for example, an image in RDBMS? Does anyone know? Suppose, for example, I wish to store uh, all the students' data. So we have students' name, PRN number as the primary key, and let's say the photograph among other fields. How will we store this in RDBMS? Yes, Nirmit, correct. One option is store these elsewhere and store the paths of the files in the table. Yes, Akash, the second answer is also correct. There is a data type in most RDBMSs, if not all, which is a binary large object or a blob. So that blob object is sort of a mixed data type. So it's something which is non-text. So there you can specify whatever data you wish to store. So for example, you have an image, you can store it. You have a video, you can store it. So the RDBMS will manage the internal complications. Naturally, while you can store all these non-text forms of data, the trouble is it may not be very efficient. It will be definitely far slower, because whatever is your original data format, most likely that will get converted internally into something which the RDBMS knows how to store and retrieve. So it is possible, but it is not natural for RDBMS. So very clear case, always remember this in practical situations, a very clear case for really thinking whether RDBMS is the choice of technology is the factor of variety. So if you have large amount of data which is going to be non-text based, simple examples, the social media posts. So when, let's say, people are creating posts, especially let's say on a platform like Instagram, which is more and more image and video based rather than text based. So if someone says, I will go ahead and store all this data in an RDBMS, that will work. So we are not saying it will not work, but that is going to be cumbersome, tedious, slow. And instead, in such cases, if we go ahead and say that RDBMS in this case does not seem to be the right choice, maybe we'll still keep the user details in RDBMS, but the actual posts that people write or the stories that they share and forward and like and all that, so all of that we will store in the form of non-SQL, non-RDBMS formats. So simple solution there could be a no SQL type of database, or even a let's say a JSON file or something which will allow you to store plain data and maybe keep pointers to non text forms of data. So variety, to summarize, refers to the forms of data. Big data comes in different forms such as structured, unstructured, semi-structured. So structured data is where we only have text. Unstructured data is where we only have non-text. And semi-structured is we have all forms of data: text, audio, video, image, and so on. So more and more applications obviously are now semi-structured, and therefore RDBMS only may not be the right choice. So what people also do is they put the structured data into RDBMS and non-structured data into a non-RDBMS platform, and they run both of them together. So big data systems need to be flexible enough to handle such variety of data. Then comes the issue of veracity. Veracity refers to how accurate is the data. To extract value from the data needs to be cleaned to remove what is called as noise or incorrect parts of data. Data-driven applications can reap the benefits of big data only when the data is meaningful and accurate. Obviously, otherwise we'll keep on giving wrong information. In the credit card situation, let's say, if let's say you have received a request asking whether this credit card transaction should go ahead, and because the data that you have is partially incorrect, if not fully wrong, you say based on the decision that your data gives that yes, go ahead and process this transaction, only to realize later that because some part of the data was not clean, you ended up giving a wrong suggestion, and actually that transaction should not have been allowed to proceed. It was a fraudulent type of transaction. Now what is the use? Because the transaction has already happened. Whosoever had to initiate and even complete the fraud, that person has been able to successfully do it. So in order that we not just store large amounts of data, that too at great speeds and having different formats, we must also be sure that the data is fairly accurate. In some cases, the data has to be 100% accurate, credit card processing. In some cases, maybe the data doesn't have to be 100% accurate, but then we can define some kind of a tolerance limit, tolerance level. Say, for example, somebody wants to live stream some audio. Now, here, what is essential is the speed. That person is expecting the audio to be played at a certain pace, certain speed. So while doing so, it may so happen that we actually lose some of the very, very fine parts of the music because the data is huge and so much data simply cannot be sent in the expected time because of the bandwidth issues. So in such cases, the veracity of data will suffer. Data may not be 100% accurate. The music may not be in the purest form, but we still go ahead and say, okay, maybe the accuracy is gone down by 5%. Maybe the listener will also notice, but he or she has to tolerate. Okay, but in data-driven applications like let's say the banking application, credit card processing, admission related issues, government contracts, bids, uh, industrial projects, airlines, traffic management, obviously there is no scope for lack of accuracy. Medical types of applications, right? That will make it worse if your data is fast but it is inaccurate. Therefore, cleansing of data is important so that incorrect and faulty data can be filtered out. So we will actually see some examples, time permitting, where that data itself contains noise, and then we have to write conditions in order to bypass such data items. So we cannot just blindly accept the input that is given to us from certain data sets and we say that, okay, whatever you give, we trust. No, based on the business rules that are given to us, we may have to worry about the veracity and therefore clean the data also. And then comes the value. So value of data refers to the usefulness of data for the intended purpose. The end goal of any big data analytics system is to extract value from data. Naturally, it's also related to the veracity, accuracy, right? Because unless the data is accurate, it may not really give us the value that we aim for. For some applications, value also depends on how fast we are able to process it. So if the objectives with which we started are not met after we run a big data project, then what is the point? Why did we invest so much of money and time in this software project is what people will ask. So this value is something which we have to always keep in mind that the customer is looking for, because otherwise what will happen is we may be very happy about the work that we do and we may think we have done some outstanding contribution. In reality, that's not really what the customer wanted in the first place. So while we worry about all the other V's, it is very important that we never lose the focus on value. Okay, I actually remember, this is not related to big data, but I think I should share this experience with you. I remember this project which we had done for Citibank in Singapore, where they used to have huge amounts of data coming in. Big data and all that was not even talked about in those days. So this was not Hadoop or anything. It was just plain simple Java based processing system using Oracle as the RDBMS. So they used to receive literally millions and millions of transactions in an XML file. So an XML file would get generated, and then we had to write code to go through that XML file, parse it, and based on certain rules, update data in the Oracle RDBMS. And the XML file, the input file itself used to be so large. I remember that to just load that file and read it, even before we started processing, that itself would take close to about an hour's time just to load the file in memory and start reading. Okay. And then the code that we wrote to parse that XML file and write data in the Oracle RDBMS, that used to take another half an hour. Okay. And overall, reading the file, doing the cleaning, processing, and writing, so this whole cycle would take close to about 2 hours. And our customer, Citibank, they told us we want to complete this whole task in not more than 1 hour. Then we said, but how is it possible? Because just to load the XML file itself, it takes about 1 hour, and to do the RDBMS processing, it takes another half an hour. So even if we optimize anything, minimum time it will take is about 1.5 hours. So 1 hour is impossible. And We tried so many options, so many uh, optimization techniques, better coding styles. Nothing worked. We were not able to bring the time down from 2 hours to uh, anything less than 1 hour and 45 minutes. That was the best that we could achieve. And then uh, Citibank, through some contacts, approached someone senior at the Oracle database team. Okay, so people who actually wrote the Oracle database and who were working on the newer versions. And those people uh, actually suggested an undocumented feature. So it was not generally available, or not many people were aware of it. But then they suggested some clause to be added to the SQL insert and update statements. And unbelievably, that half an hour which we used to take to insert into the tables and update into those tables, that half an hour reduced to 5 minutes. And it sounds unbelievable to me even today, but I still remember uh, running those sample examples pre and post making that optimization change. And the time reduction was absolutely dramatic. So one internal optimization based on that change to the query reduced the time by 25 minutes. And that is when the real value to the customer was seen. Until then, no matter what we were doing, from our point of view, we were trying our best and we thought we have really done well. But the customer was not very happy. The customer was saying, fine, you have written some code, yes, you are giving me the correct results, but my intention is to finish this whole thing in 1.5 hours, and you're not able to do it. But because of this fine tuning, finally it worked. And that is where the value really lied. Frankly, unless and until this help came from Oracle, we were clueless and we would not have been able to deliver the value. So uh, always keep this point in mind, that we as maybe programmers, testers, architects, okay, or people who are working on creating some software, we have one vision of what the customer wants. And we think that if we write great code and if we manage to deliver what the customer expects in terms of the output, that's the job done. But many times, customers' own interpretation of what really is the value is very different. And you obviously keep on learning only through such types of experiences. Okay, so because the term value came here, I remembered this, although it's not really directly related to what we are discussing. Okay, I'll skip some of the slides which maybe are not relevant to our scope. Okay, so there are so many areas where big data is now used. So all this is a list of where it is used. Another interesting point which many students have a confusion about, or not just students, a lot of people have a confusion about, is where is the boundary between data analytics and data science ending. Again, there's no fixed answer to this, and many times both of these are actually more or less merged also. But if we have to be very uh, correct and accurate in terms of distinguishing between these two terms, we could say that data analytics is more of what we call as the descriptive and diagnostic type of analytics. So it will answer things such as what happened, why did it happen, So as I mentioned, in the case of a credit card transaction, it will say, for instance, that this particular transaction looks to be suspicious, and why. So it will tell you that maybe we are saying that this transaction appears to be suspicious because normally this credit card is used only in the cities of Pune and Mumbai. No, so till now, nowhere other than these two cities was this card ever used. Secondly, the amounts for which the card normally gets used is so those amounts are anywhere between say 500 rupees to about 10,000 rupees. But now suddenly there is a transaction that is being attempted which is for 50,000 rupees, and that too uh, not in Pune and Mumbai, from elsewhere. Thirdly, the type of transactions that this person normally does are, let's say, filling petrol, that is at the fuel or uh, petrol or diesel stations, or in a restaurant, or to buy things like groceries and some general items. But all of a sudden, now this particular credit card has been used to book a vehicle, and 50,000 rupees are being spent. So all these indicate that this transaction seems to be an odd one. We cannot conclusively say that this is a fake transaction or a not fake, but transaction which is a fraudulent variety. But suspicion of that being a fraudulent transaction is very high. That's what data analytics will tell you, and which is why we use technologies such as Hadoop. And within the Hadoop suite, we have a lot of other things like Apache Hive, Pig, Taze, which is now actually called as Spark, Impala, Spark SQL, and all that. Whereas data science will focus on the future. So having known what has happened and why it happened, data science will say what is likely to happen next. And if you wish to prevent something from happening, how should you prevent it? So that is what is called as the predictive and prescriptive type of analytics. So here, instead of relying on a lot of technical skills, people will use many times their mathematical and modeling types of abilities, statistical abilities, to create prediction models. And again, technologies that we use there are uh, the same that we use in data analytics, plus Python, because it is now giving many more ready-made libraries and packages to handle data science related tasks, and R as the other language, which is also commonly used for statistical programming. But obviously not just these two, many more exist. So somebody who wishes to become a data scientist will start with data analytics, get familiar with Hadoop, MapReduce style of programming, HDFS, and maybe a tool like Apache Pig and Spark, and then get into the predictive and prescriptive part of it. But uh, not everyone may also go to the data science level, because people who are more technical in nature may wish to actually remain in data analytics itself, because that also is a very, very important branch. Okay? And data science obviously is something where more and more of analytical rather than technical skills will come in play. Okay, any questions again up to this point?
No, sir.
All right. Yeah, I'm just trying to also restrict myself to key concepts, and also not uh, to try and bore you, because if we look at theory, there are many things that we can talk of, but my idea is you should only know what you will be finding useful in your real life. And whenever you are trying any practical examples and learning code, what is the background? What is the theory that will help you? Okay, so these are the only 2-3 things that I'm keeping in mind. Otherwise, the whole thing could be just theory instead of trying any hands-on. So some part of Hadoop, I think we had discussed, and that is what I'll quickly review, and we'll move forward on the same thing. So currently, for example, we are using Hadoop 2.8, which is 2.0 next version. Some people may have Hadoop 3, but the key difference between Hadoop 1 and Hadoop 2, just to recap, is that in Hadoop 1, we had only 2 layers. One was the HDFS layer, which we access by running our HDFS commands like cat and mkdir and remove a directory and list the directory contents and all that. So that is the HDFS, which is going to store all the data. And it is called as redundant and reliable storage because it creates multiple copies, so that in case of failures in hardware or software, we still have reliable storage because of the backups or the other copies. And on top of HDFS layer, we used to have the MapReduce layer, which used to do 2 things. One was the cluster resource management, and second was the data processing task. So as we can see here in Hadoop 2.0, HDFS more or less has remained the same, but MapReduce has been moved up to a separate layer, and one intermediate layer has been sort of sandwiched in, which is the YARN layer, which is now responsible for cluster resource management. So out of these 2 tasks, cluster resource management and data processing, cluster resource management task has been given to YARN, whereas a data processing function is handled by MapReduce. So this is where we write our code. So we write the map function, we write the reduce function, and then our input file that we read, if it's stored, for example, in HDFS, what will happen is YARN will bring in that file from HDFS, and it will make it available to our MapReduce code. Of course, because that is our traditional thinking, I'm just describing it like this, but in real life, what happens is MapReduce code actually goes to wherever the data is located. So YARN layer is responsible for making sure that it takes the map code, it takes the reduce code, and then it takes the code to wherever the data is stored. And then from that particular processing that happens here, whatever is the outcome or result, YARN takes it and gives it back to our MapReduce layer, which is where we print the output or do whatever we wish with the output. So it's not just MapReduce, of course, because later on people started realizing that simpler tools could be developed to maybe make MapReduce programming easier. And hence we had things such as Apache Pig, and in modern times, more than uh, Apache Pig. Okay, let's go to the slide. Apache Spark. Okay, I don't know where is the slide. Anyway, okay, we'll come back to it. Another view of the same thing is that we have HDFS, which is the storage layer, YARN, which is the resource management and MapReduce, which is the application layer. Of course, this is shown in the reverse order. So normally HDFS is considered to be at the bottom, then Yarn at the middle, and MapReduce at the top. So our interface as programmers is generally at this layer. So this is where we write our MapReduce code and then let Yarn and HDFS manage it. But because we write MapReduce code, it's also essential to know how the resource management happens by way of Yarn, and how does HDFS store the data, and therefore how do we access that data also, okay, which is what we will attempt to do next. So before we go for the break, just a quick summary of these three. So HDFS, Hadoop Distributed File System, provides for the storage of Hadoop. As the name suggests, it stores the data in a distributed manner. The file gets divided into a number of blocks, which spreads across the cluster of commodity hardware, which means that it does not require any specific hardware as such, but any hardware which is available, even including cloud-based hardware. Second layer, the middle layer, is the Yarn, yet another resource manager, which provides resource management for Hadoop. There are two daemons running for Yarn, two daemons in the sense two processes. One is node manager on the slave machines, and other is resource manager on the master node. You may not understand the whole thing here, which is okay. We will go through it. Right now, just remember these two: node manager, resource manager. So those of us who have been able to install and run Hadoop successfully, you would have noticed that when Hadoop starts successfully, 4 command prompts or 4 processes start. 2 of those are node manager and resource manager. So they correspond to the Yarn processes. So if Hadoop is running successfully, Yarn starts these two daemons or these two processes, and that's why we see these two. Yarn looks after the allocation of resources among the various slaves competing for it. And MapReduce, this is the processing engine of Hadoop. It works on the principle of distributed processing. So it divides the task submitted by the user into a number of independent subtasks, and these subtasks execute in parallel, thereby increasing the throughput. Okay. So this is the stack or the layer architecture of Hadoop, which is of 3 layers, and out of which, as I said, we normally interact with the MapReduce layer. Since this is taking more time than what I initially anticipated, even post the break, we will continue to discuss the same thing instead of jumping back to examples. So today, maybe I'll just finish the remaining part of theory, and if time permits, we'll go back to examples. But more importantly, in the remaining part of the theory, we would now try and understand from a high level rather than from a high level perspective. We'll go in a more detailed perspective and see how these three, that is HDFS, Yarn, and MapReduce work. Okay, so then we will be able to link whatever examples, coding related things we are trying, how they relate to the actual Hadoop that we have installed, and why certain things are written in certain ways. Okay, why is the coding style or programming style the way it is? All right, so we will do that after we come back from the break. So we'll resume our discussion. It's 9:02. So we'll start say at around 9:12. Okay, in the meanwhile, if you do have any questions, do put them on the chat. Okay, we'll resume in another 10 minutes from now. Okay, hi everyone. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
All right. So I don't know, frankly, what happened because I could see all of you, and I could also see the screen being shared. So I went on speaking. So let's do this. After this session, just check on the Teams recording, okay, whether whatever I spoke post the break is available instead of just repeating the whole thing. And if it's not there, just let me know. I'll repeat whatever I spoke next time.
Is it possible if you could give a brief recap?
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do in the next few minutes, and then we'll complete the attendance. Okay. So what I spoke about was in Hadoop, when we start Hadoop using this start dash all command, okay, four services start, and those four services namely are the Hadoop name node, secondly Hadoop data node, thirdly Yarn resource manager, and the fourth one is Yarn node manager. Okay, so I'll just share the screen and show this to you. So I hope you can see that there is this Yarn node manager. Then second is Yarn resource manager, Hadoop data node, and Hadoop name node, right? So if you look at what we discussed, so Yarn, as we saw, has two daemons or two processes. One is the node manager and second is the resource manager. So corresponding to these two, we have these two processes running. So Yarn has resource manager and Yarn has node manager, of which the resource manager runs on something called as the master node, and node manager is the one which runs on the slave nodes. Similarly, the two Hadoop HDFS services, which are name node and data node. Name node runs on what we call as the master node. Data node is what runs on the slave nodes. So naturally, if you are talking about master slave, we must know what is this master slave. And that is exactly what is shown here. So we as the user or programmer submit our work to the master, and the master then decides how to delegate that work to the slaves. It's not really parent child, so to say, in the sense that the master does not create its own identical process as a slave process, unlike what happens, let's say, in a fork process call. Uh, so it's not parent child that way, but it's divided into master slave architecture. So master is the one which takes the work from the user and acts as the controller. For example, which slave should do what work will be governed by the master. And therefore, on master, what run are two processes, one for HDFS, one for Yarn. So for HDFS, name node runs, and for Yarn, resource manager runs. And on the slave machines, again, we have two processes. For HDFS, it is data node, and for Yarn, it is node manager. Okay. So because we have installed Hadoop on a single machine, we actually see all the four running on our own machine. But in real life, when we have a distributed architecture, we will only see the name node and the resource manager running on the master node. whereas the slave machines will have data node and node manager, right? So there we will see only two processes on our master node. Then what I mentioned was, how does this happen? So on a name node, the main information about the files is kept. Remember again, what is name node? Name node is the HDFS master node. Okay? So which means the main information about the file. So the main information about the file is kept in the name node. So for example, when we create a file inside HDFS, when we upload a file, then the name node keeps information about what is the file size, on which data nodes does it reside. For example, if the file is quite large, the name node may actually split the file into several blocks and put some blocks here, and all that. So whenever we ask HDFS to load a file, so we run a cat command. Our command will go to the name node, which will then go to the data nodes to appropriately bring the right blocks, construct the file, reconstruct the file, and display it to us. Okay. So internally, this will happen. We will not know that the file has been split among several data nodes and all that. The name node is the one which will do it for us. In a similar manner, we will submit our jobs or submit our code to resource manager. So what is the resource manager again? Resource manager is the master of YARN, just as name node is the master of HDFS. So when we, for example, write a MapReduce program, we submit it to the resource manager. And the resource manager in turn takes the help of node managers. Node managers are the processes for YARN running on the slaves. So for example, let's say we write a large program, then the resource manager will hand it over simultaneously to several node managers. Node managers in turn may contact for the data purpose the name node, and name node in turn will fetch the data from the respective blocks. So to simplify this, let's take a practical example. Suppose let's say we write a MapReduce program. That program will get all the employee records as we had in our last example, and then it finds out who are the blue collar employees, and we wish to find the average of all those salaries. How will this happen? Our program will get submitted to the resource manager. Resource manager will look at the code, will look at how many operations are required, how many nodes are available for execution, and maybe it will say, I will now invoke 2 of the nodes. I have 4 available, but maybe they are busy. So these 2 are free. So our MapReduce code has been given by the resource manager to the node managers. Node manager looks at the code, realizes that a particular file needs to be accessed. Node manager cannot access the file. So node manager takes the code and gives it or hands it over to the name node. So from MapReduce code, control had come to YARN, that is resource manager, master. From there it has gone to node manager, that is slave of YARN. From there it has now gone to name node, which is HDFS master, which now identifies which is the file that we are trying to open. So it sees, for example, that the file is, what was the name of the file? Say bank.csv. Then it knows that this particular file has been actually split across 3 data nodes. The first 2 blocks are here, next 2 blocks are here, last block is here. So it takes the MapReduce code which was given to it, by the node managers. It takes that code and actually passes on to the data nodes. Remember, in Hadoop, data doesn't come to code code goes to data. So name node passes on the code to data nodes. The code executes on these three data nodes. So firstly, the map code will execute independently on these three machines. The mapper output will be produced here, will be produced here, will be produced here, and that will be collected by the name node. It will be handed over to the node manager or the respective node managers who will collect it, give it back to the resource manager. Resource manager will give it to us. We will say whatever is the output of the map code, now pass it on to the reduce code. Same process. Our request will go to the resource manager. Resource manager will invoke the node managers. Need not necessarily be the two same node managers again, whosoever are available. Those node managers will in turn pass it on to the name node. Name node will again see which file it is, bang.csv. Again knows that it is stored across these three data nodes. So it will pass the reducer code onto these three. Reducer code will execute on these three independently on those data blocks. Finally, the output will be collected by the name node. Name node will pass it on to the respective node managers. Respective node managers will again collect the output, pass on the final output to the resource manager. Resource manager will pass it back to us. Why is it done in this manner? So that the same code can execute in parallel on multiple machines. That is why we write the code as map reduce. We don't write the whole code as one single program, so that the map functions can execute simultaneously on different machines. Once the map functions are over, same is true with the reduce code, and which is where I was trying to answer the question of Akash, and then I actually checked whether I was audible. So Akash, as you can see, because we are passing the code to the yarn layer, that is resource manager, who in turn will pass it to the node manager, who will pass it onto the name node, regardless of whether we write the sort code or we use, let's say, the system generated function.
So I couldn't hear the last part you said. It was not audible.
Okay, so because we are writing the code in the form of map and reduce separately, this code will run independently on several machines at the same time. So even if, let's say, we write the sorting code in Python, that code will also get distributed across several machines and it will run in parallel. So if the confusion was that if we write the sort code, what will Hadoop do? So Hadoop will continue to do the same thing, which is to take our code, distribute it to several machines, run them in parallel, gather the output, give the final output back to us. And which is why, if you recollect, those of you who have been able to run examples on HDFS also, you would remember that the output is actually created as part dash dash dash, right? From 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 2, and all that. Why? Because that is processed by one machine and there'll be multiple parts. If, let's say, we have large amounts of data and we will see those parts combined as the final output. So why are we doing all this? Because we are asking Hadoop to take our map reduce code and run it in parallel at the same time on several machines. So the overall processing will be much faster. So if we have 1 lakh records and we distribute it on 10 machines, roughly 10,000 records will get processed on one machine, rather than one machine having to process 1 lakh records. Naturally, this will be faster. There are overheads, of course, to collect and merge the output once it is processed, but those overheads are lesser than running a single job on a single machine. That is the main purpose of using Hadoop. So this is more or less what I had explained in the so-called blacked out part. I am not sure whether it's there in the recording, but even if it is not there, I have sort of once again summarized it. So hopefully it's clear, but just in case, any questions? Okay, how many of you are clear about what we discussed? That was the question I asked, and then I realized that I was talking to myself earlier. So let me ask it once again. How many of us are clear about what we discussed today? So this time I'm definitely audible. Okay, all right. So do go through the recording in case you're not clear about some concepts, because in the remaining time I had to sort of wrap up the discussion. However, if the earlier blacked out period is also there in the recording, hopefully it will be clearer to you. If it's not there, unfortunately, and you don't understand some of the concepts, do let me know once again individually on the chat. And if there are a sufficient number of students who are not clear, I'll once again go through this next time, because it's important to be able to sync up our theoretical understanding with what we do in practice. Yes, somebody is saying something.
Sir, have you taken the attendance?
I haven't, because there was no time,
Okay.
unfortunately, because of this loss. So I'll take it from Microsoft Teams for today.
Sir, I was facing a very bad connectivity problem from my end, so I was very often getting dropped from the call. That's why I asked.
All right. I'll take it from Teams, not to worry. Okay, before we stop, any other questions? Fine, there are still some, maybe one or two things which from a conceptual point of view I need to discuss. So I'll cover those, and then we will go back to our examples. And I hope with this understanding, trying out those examples will be more rewarding, because hopefully you will understand what we are doing better than the way we understand till date. Okay. So with this, looking at the time, we are almost reaching the end of today's session. So do go through, as I said, the recording, and let me know in case something is not clear. All right. So we'll meet once again next week. Until then, have a safe, sound, enjoyable weekend, and see you in a week's time. Take care.
Thank you, sir.
And bye-bye.
Thank you so much.